Okay, everybody, we're going to get started here in just a minute. Thanks for joining us. So welcome, everyone. This is Lara Jakubowski at the Nonprofit Centers Network here in Denver with Katie Edwards. We're excited about today's webinar. And we have a really special guest today and a great topic to talk about. So we're going to quickly move into that. Megan Davenport is joining us from Denver Shared Spaces, and she's going to talk about community animation and leveraging property management to build collaboration, which dovetails into a lot of what we've talked about and will be talking about. We're going to just go over some housekeeping items before we turn it over to Megan. We want to welcome all of our members, and just a reminder that the Online Resource Center is always available to you. You get discounts on events and publications, and you are also eligible for a free hour of consulting every year. So if you have any questions about any of that, please be in touch with me or Katie. For those of you who haven't been on our webinars before, the way we will handle questions is you will type in the dashboard on the right your questions. You can type them in at any point in time, and we'll share them with Megan. And at the end of her presentation, or actually if it comes in the middle, she'll just answer them as they come, as she decides. So please go ahead and do that. And so with that, I'm going to transfer it over to Megan. I've worked with Megan for a lot of years before I joined NCN, and it's a pleasure to be working with her now that I'm working at NCN. And she's just got a wealth of information about this topic, and we're really looking forward to hearing her presentation. So,
thank you, Lara. Hi, everyone. Megan Davenport here, Program Manager with Denver Shared Spaces, as Lara mentioned. And I am really excited to be here today to talk about this topic. So today's agenda, we're going to cover a number of things, I think we'll get through it all, but namely centering on this concept of really leveraging your property management approach to allow for increased opportunities for collaboration and relationship development within your centers. Today we'll cover the shifting role of property management broadly within the commercial real estate sector, as well as specific to shared spaces. We'll explore how to clarify your center's approach to property management and connect it back up to your mission and vision as an organization. And then we'll dig into two different property management models within shared space. I'm building on some local examples that I've observed here in Denver, in the Denver region. We'll look into what some of the positive impacts of those models are, and then we'll wrap up with some additional resources. So as Lara mentioned, if at any point during this conversation you've got questions or would like to chime in with your own expertise and experience, I know a lot of you on the call are already implementing some of these strategies, and so I'd welcome your feedback from your on-the-ground experience, and we'll try to touch in on that as we go along. So here I am, just smiling to beat the band, and I wanted to just give you a little bit of context about who I am, since you can't see me, and why you should trust me, since many of you don't know me. So my background is as a community social worker. So I've got about 10 years in on the nonprofit and public sector, the last 3+ of which have been in the context of nonprofit and social purpose real estate. My background is in counseling and advocacy, which has given me a systems framework. So I really approach things from the perspective of how do we address organizational systems, policy systems, the kinds of structures that are operating in our communities in ways that really help the individuals thrive. What my background as a social worker brings to the table is a strong equity lens and a focus on inclusion and addressing some of those systemic barriers that impact our communities. And then the last thing I'll say is that I'm not quote unquote classically trained, if you will, in real estate. My background is as a social worker, so I approach my work with shared space from a people and systems perspective. So what you'll be seeing in today's presentation is real estate from a social worker's point of view. So for those of you on the call who are classically trained, if you will, I also welcome your feedback and where I can refine my own content here. Okay, so let's get started. Shifting role of property management. Just briefly, we've got some interesting changes going on in the commercial real estate sector, particularly as it relates to property management. So from a recent Building Owners and Managers Association benchmark study, it looks as though over half of commercial properties are managed in-house by the owner of the property. My guess is that that's going to fall, but going to be true, or maybe even more so for many of you on the call. We find that a lot of our shared spaces in the NCN network are what we called owner occupied. So you've got an owner entity that is also occupying and managing this space. We've seen an increase in focus on tenant relationship management. That's sort of the wordy version of what they call it in the commercial real estate property management sector. There's a growing focus on that as a set of priorities within property management corporations, because they're seeing that that translates into dollars for them, and it translates into more satisfied tenants. About 50% or more of the tenant relationship management function is provided by the property manager or facility manager. So again, this might be falling similar to y'all, that there's not necessarily a specialized role in these organizations with people who have super awesome, tenant community building skills, but rather, are just going about their day-to-day job and adding this tenant relations piece in. And then the last thing that I'll share is that based on NCN's recent survey, State of the Sector survey, we found that, or they found rather, that the average shared space in their network has 2 full-time equivalent staff running the show. So what this again says to me is that those of you who are on the call, those of you who are working to manage centers are probably doing it on a pretty lean staff structure. In addition to some of these industry trends, what we're seeing is workplace trends that are really impacting or have the potential to impact the property management function. So first off, we've got changing demographics and work styles. So I'm sure that you all have heard about the baby boomers. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they are preparing to exit en masse from the workforce. They're going to leave some major shoes to fill. And what we're seeing as part of this demographic trend is that as they're exiting these career paths, their jobs are actually being replaced not by full-time employees, but often by freelancers that are from the millennial or Gen X generations. This means that there's this shift to a more flexible and less rigid work force out there. We also see that millennials are going to soon comprise the largest demographic in the US. There's currently 73 million people in the US aged 18 to 34. While this is still smaller than the baby boomers, it's the biggest generation in the last 30 years. So what this says is that we're going to be seeing more young folks moving into jobs, leadership jobs, management jobs within our centers, and that shortly behind them, and this statistic kind of startled me a bit, is that in 2016 we will see the first college graduates from what they're calling the Centennial generation or Generation Z. So these are the ones following the millennials. Yes, folks, they are legal to drink, they're legal to work, and they're going to be coming to your centers sometime soon. So what we see with these generational shifts is that these shifts, coupled with an increasing accessibility and integration of mobile technology into our approach to work, means that we will see continued shifts in how the workforce answers the question of where and when to get work done. This leads me to our second trend that we're seeing in workspace, which is a shifting use of common spaces. What we're finding is that there's an increased emphasis in on-site amenities, an increased integration of quality technology, mobile, cloud-based, wireless access, fast service, et cetera. And these support increased off-site or work from anywhere kinds of work environments. What this probably looks like in your centers is a lot more folks posting up in the common spaces, potentially working from less traditional office settings and seeking out spaces that are not your traditional workspace. In addition, one interesting note that I found in response to this shift, we're seeing office furniture designers and commercial interior designers increasingly looking to what they call a collegiate design. Collegiate design influences to guide the next generation of workspaces. So instead of creating these farms of cubes, which we have come to know and love in our office buildings, taking a page out of the student union and library settings that provide for a more flexible work environment. The last workplace trend that I'll name is the fact that we've just in reality got a shrinking workplace. The footprint of workspace in the US has shrunk over the last well, it's shrunk from 2010 it was 225 square feet per employee, and now it's down to about 150 square feet per employee. So this means that we're packing more people into smaller spaces than before. In addition, the average lease size is down 8% over the past 10 years. What this means for our buildings is that we've got nearly a 35% increase in the number of people working in our buildings. This increase puts additional stress on building systems, parking, utilities, your elevators, restrooms, mechanical equipment, common spaces, blah, blah, blah. Not to mention impact on your refrigerator and dishwashers in your common areas. If any of you have been on the NCN listserv recently, you'll know that that's been a bit of a concern again. So yeah, this increased densification is what they're calling it, means that it's got impacts both for how you manage people, but also for how you're managing your building. So what we see in all of this is some pretty common challenges between our turf over here in the nonprofit shared space arena and the more broader view of the commercial real estate sector at large. All of us are stuck with balancing competing priorities, both in the form of building systems management as well as people management, trying to accommodate the needs of both. There are common challenges around consistent communication tools with a singular focus on day-to-day, oftentimes putting out fires, things of that nature. It's hard to have that strategic and consistent tenant outreach. We've also heard from folks, both, again, broadly as well as the subset of nonprofit shared space managers, that there are really limited mechanisms to understand overall tenant-employee satisfaction beyond your single point of contact. So for those of you out there who are managing centers that are comprised of larger organizations, so not your typical co-working where you maybe have a sole proprietor or your one member is your point of contact, when you've got 12 tenants, each employing 15 or more people, you're probably not getting face time with each of those employees, which means that it's hard to really know what the overall sense of satisfaction and productivity is in your building, given that you're interacting likely with just one. The last thing that we see across the board is that we're kind of slow to respond to a changing workforce. Changing workforce demands, when we get a system in place that seems to be working, it's tough for us to let it go. We don't want to shift once we've got a system in place. But what we're seeing is that, again, with these demographic shifts, the likelihood is that we will continue to see shifts in how we need to manage our spaces. So from there, I move into how do we go about making sure that our property management strategy fits with what it is we need in our buildings. So as with anything, I start with vision and goals. It's really critical to me to start with a clear sense of who cares and why are we doing this before jumping into solutions. So to take a step back and clarify your center's approach, deciding how and if and how rather to shift your property management first requires clarity on why you might want to make a change. So step one, we focus on how our property management connects back to the overall vision and mission of your organization or of your center. What this looks like is sort of a mini strategic plan, if you will, that focuses specifically on center management functions and rolls back up into the larger strategic vision. The ways you might go about this are to answer these questions. So how does the way you manage your center, both from a facility perspective and from an interpersonal perspective, connect back to your center's overall mission? What does success look like for your property management functions? Does it look like zero vacancy? Does it look like low turnover? Does it look like reports of satisfaction? Decide on what those success measures look like. And then the last question to pose is, what specific goals would move you forward toward that success? What kinds of things need to be in place so that you can ensure that you are putting systems and strategies in place that move you in that direction, as well as capturing whether or not it is you are actually achieving that? I wanted to also just name before I move on that I am guessing that a lot of you on the call are that person in your center that go to meetings and come away with a long to-do list. And as I was putting these slides together, I realized that's kind of what this presentation is too, because we're really just outlining a lot of next steps because there are no easy answers to getting this right. So sorry, please stick with me. I promise it's useful, but I just wanted to name that that's probably going to be the outcome. So the next step in this process is to define your customer. I find that oftentimes we don't pause to think about who is it that we're actually serving with our property management functions. So whose needs are you meeting? To whom are you accountable? And if your tenants are organizations with multiple employees, is each employee a customer? Or is just the ED or just the office manager or just whomever you interface with, is that person your customer? One way to sort of parse this out, and then we've been teasing this out here in our local managers roundtable, is your center oriented around a service delivery model? So is your intent to provide quality services to your tenants and function in that landlord capacity, which is probably part of your job, if not all of it? Or are you really focusing on more of a relational community building approach? If it's the latter, you can't disregard the former, right? But you need to be very clear with your tenants when you onboard them that you are focusing on that community building and relationship approach, because the likely expectation, especially for those folks who weren't signing the lease, who aren't, who are the direct line workers, if you will, their assumption is going to be that your job as the landlord is to make sure the Wi-Fi works and the coffee pot is on, right? So figuring out and messaging that balance is really critical in defining your customer. It will also help define your scope of work as a property manager. And then the last piece, and this is probably the hardest, is to balance your role. So you as the property manager, community animator, community manager, facilitator, ED, whatever your title might be, figure out how that role, get clear on what that role is and get clear on what that role isn't. This will help significantly as you plan how you and your team, or if you are a team of one, how you or a team of one gets the job at your center done. So as that core person responsible, how do you function related to your customers and related to your mission and vision? And use this analysis to guide how you manage your workflow to maximize efficiency and keep your vision and goals central to how you get the job done and not lose that in the mix. So from there, we'll move on to a couple of different models for property management and some options for implementing them in your center. So the equation that I came up with on how you decide this is you take your vision, you add in your goals. This is kind of big picture vision and goals, plus whatever skills you have already at the table, whatever in-house skills and expertise you have in your organization, in your center. Subtract from that whatever gaps you might have, and what you have are, actually, as I'm looking at this, the math might not totally work out with words, but what you end up with are the skills needed to enhance your management. So wherever those gaps are, whatever's remaining, that's what we're seeking to fill with these two models. So the first step you can consider is to import expertise and capacity. Hire you some consultants. So the way that this might look, for example, is to hire a third party that provides tenant relationship support, community engagement, liaison work that functions in that sort of warm body connection point for your tenants to interface with property management. The goals of this approach would be to engage tenants, to support the property management team, to increase connections, and probably, honestly, to streamline some of the relationship building and communications that are already happening in your center. The way that you could go about applying this approach, this import expertise approach, is define what success looks like, assess your in-house skills, expertise, and capacity, identify what those gaps are, and then kind of simultaneous with that, quantify what your financial capacity is. What can you afford to hire? How much do you have? You probably don't have any extra in your budget, but what is it worth to you to have someone come in and help support this component of your work? Develop that clear scope of work and identify your partner in this, and then communicate clearly what the role of that third party is back to your tenants. Some case examples of this, the first would be ongoing capacity support, similar to what DSS provides here locally in the form of our tenant liaison program. What this is a handful of hours a week dedicated to specific buildings serving specific functions that complement the existing property management approach. The property managers for the 3 buildings that we're currently working in are they've got pretty much on lock the tenant leasing and recruitment portions, the capital improvements, the ongoing day-to-day facility management. Where they really have a gap and where they need support is around both the ongoing communications with their tenants, so providing a consistent public face, as well as facilitating the ongoing interactions. So monthly tenant meetings, special programs, and events or cross-training that's happening in the space. So what this functions as is really to target the specific needs, gaps to fill for the property management, to communicate clearly what those services and supports are, and then to evaluate, providing some of that evaluation at the both ongoing and at the end of the year around how are your tenants feeling, what is their level of satisfaction, and how likely are they basically to stay. Another approach or option along these lines of importing expertise is one-time or intermittent facilitation. So this could be somebody that you bring in from the outside to serve a short-term function. One of the great examples of this is a new program launched by Nonprofit Centers Network, which is their Collaboration Kickoff program. So in this, they facilitate a half-day training where representatives or all members of your shared space come together and go through a series of facilitated exercises that help move them, focus them in on what the opportunities are around collaboration or even just coordination, getting on the same page about what each other does, provides that external facilitation that might be a little trickier for you to do yourself, and then gives you a guide, you and potential tenant leaders that rise up from that experience, a guide for follow-up steps. So the pros of this, the benefits of this approach, it is likely more cost effective than hiring around whatever your challenges might be. It allows you to bring in targeted expertise either in an ongoing fashion or for those short-term engagements. And it also works well with lighter touch models. So for those folks out there who are managing centers that really function mostly as affordable office space with a little bit of a less of a focus on high levels of integration, cross promotion, or wraparound service, this is the kind of lighter touch model that I'm describing, where layering in some external expertise around tenant interaction can be really beneficial. This also allows for piloting of more robust community animation approaches. So if you've got a landlord or a board maybe that's a little skeptical of hiring somebody with animation in their title, this could be a good way to go about piloting it and being able to demonstrate some positive impact. Of course, there are downsides to it. It probably won't provide ongoing support. It's not probably going to be a person that will be a consistent face with whom tenants will build a trusting and long-lasting relationship, and it will likely come with some limited in-person capacity. The other challenges can be that it can be confusing to tenants, depending on how you communicate this person's role and the level of interaction they have with this person and with you, and being able to be really clear about communications and boundaries is essential. And the last thing is, because of those aforementioned downsides, it's probably a slower route to results. You're probably not going to see your tenants coming together to bring down a $5 million Bloomberg grant to change childhood obesity in your region next week using this approach. Now, an approach that might get you there, although no promises, is to build your in-house team. So what this brings is additional staff focus on tenant and community management. So anywhere between a 0.5 to a full-time FTE that is dedicated to tenant and community animation or engagement approaches. The goals of this would be to enhance your value-add programming, to help maintain and extend the culture within the building, and to really strategically and intentionally increase collaborative relationships between your tenant partners. The process, pretty similar to the other model that I described: define what success looks like, assess your in-house skills, expertise, and capacity, identify what gaps you're trying to hire for, can you even afford it, quantify that financial capacity and how to get there, and then hire for the skills that you need. Really hone in on what it is that you need to fill within your existing staffing set. So is it the people skills and the engagement opportunities? Is it the logistics and organization? Identify and decide what you need to fill, and then fill that gap through your hiring process. And then, of course, engage in a thorough onboarding and onboarding process to bring that person up to speed in their role. And then the last piece that I threw in here, a little bit for our own benefit here at DSS, but also make a plan for staff development for that person. This role is pretty new within property management, within nonprofit center management, this idea of hiring a person solely dedicated to community facilitation and animation. There are a few folks out there that have a strong support network around it. So I encourage you setting aside some budget to ensure that they have access to the kinds of professional development supports that they need to be really strong in that role. So some case examples here, what I'm calling property management plus, or property management 2.0. I don't know, maybe that's too strong of a word, but in this example, what you've done is you've hired somebody in your facility management role, in your property management role. That surprise is that awesomely nuanced person that has both a facility lens and the people skills necessary to foster that kind of interaction and relationship, to develop tenant bonds and connections and empower tenant leaders. I don't know if Dustin is actually on the call, but I don't want to blow up your ego too much, Dustin, but I'm going to highlight the House of Neighborly Service Life Center in Loveland, Colorado as a case example of this property management plus approach, where Dustin was hired on as the facility manager and happens to also have the skill set needed to sort of cultivate the kinds of interactions and relationships within the center that move the center in this direction. The other example or option or approach to this is what I call an enhanced staffing structure. So this is where your financial model actually allows you to hire specialized staff in a facilities role and in a community animation role. So an example of this would be here in Denver, the Posner Center for International Development has staff functions that allow for them to kind of delegate and distribute those roles. What's necessary here is to create an organizational structure that supports that, to ensure that there's financial models and funds available to hire for that, and then to delegate tasks as appropriate to each of those roles. Now, of course, as those of you who are probably seeing yourselves in either of these examples know, there are pros and cons to this approach as well. So on the benefit side, it definitely adds to your staff capacity, and it can put you in a position to increase your programming, make the case to your tenants that you're offering a lot more, that the sum of the parts is greater for them being in the space because of their access to value-add programs. It allows you to have a consistent face to build ongoing relationships with tenants, and enhances opportunities for specialization, either through task and workflow or through training. Some of the downsides is that it's pretty critical to make the right hire in this case. The skill sets, again, are sometimes hard to know at the outset, especially if you're at the beginning of creating a new center, to know who it is you're going to need to fill those shoes. It can also result in siloed staff functions. What we find here locally in our managers roundtable is that it's really kind of a false distinction to say your building is separate from your tenants. Say, okay, that guy's the facility guy, he'll take care of all the facilities. I don't know why I made the facility guy a guy. Sorry out there, ladies who do facilities management. And that guy over there is the tenant relations person, and he'll take all the tenant relations, and then never the twain shall meet. That's kind of false because as we all know, people interface and influence the environment and vice versa. So having specialized staff can be a benefit, but can also be a challenge to ensure that there's consistency across the board. It's financially challenging to support more than 1 or 2 FTE. There are very thin margins in the shared space model, even on the for-profit side. And then finally, the risk of burnout is very high for this role. What we find is that a person who's hired in as your property management plus person wears multiple hats, puts out a lot of fires, and can end up in a position to be burned out pretty easily. So it's something to be very aware of if you go this route. So some important considerations across the board. I could let you read them, but I'll read them out loud because this is very critical. Start out with what your tenants have to say about their needs. Perhaps they're just satisfied with the way things are going, and you don't need to try to shoehorn them into getting to know each other more. I, of course, being the social worker that I am, firmly believe that everyone should know everyone and find ways to work together. However, that's just not how everyone works. And so ask your tenants, listen to them, and take their feedback very seriously. An additional consideration is to really dig into what your financial model is and how your financial model is built to support staffing for your center. The reality is that very few centers run effectively and sustainably on a shoestring skeleton crew or on a volunteer management structure. I'm not saying it's not possible, but it's pretty tough. So to take a close look at what your financial model looks like and how you can eke out some staffing support from that model and ensure that whatever you're paying for in the form of staffing is a good fit for your tenant needs. Consider your current staffing structure. Consider whether there are existing staff skills that are going uncapitalized upon. Can you leverage somebody's skill set to create more of a community environment to enhance your culture? Perhaps there's someone already on your team that loves to decorate for the holiday, for each holiday, or loves to spearhead potlucks. Take advantage of that and direct that energy in a way that can really promote connectivity within your space. If you decide you need to hire either a third party or an in-house staff person, get very clear on those skill sets. I know I said it before, I'm saying it again, hire right and fail fast if you hire the wrong person. And then the last two considerations are, what does the broader community stand to gain from the addition of this sort of enhanced property management strategy? So by adding in community animation within your center, how does that benefit the people outside your walls? And that leads me to this last consideration, which is, how do you know if you're succeeding? Ideally, success measures are going to be connected not just internally to how your center is functioning, but also externally to the impacts that you're having on your space around you. So the top 5 reasons to do this: it creates space for collaborative relationships to blossom, and it creates space, just to add on to that, create space for collaborative relationships to blossom in sometimes magical ways. You don't have to be the handholder for this, but taking this approach of creating space for relationships can allow for connections to happen well outside of what you could even imagine. It empowers tenants. It sets up a structure where you can actually share leadership and offload some of your day-to-day management activities potentially to your tenant base. Increases tenant satisfaction. We've seen this demonstrated, and we know that increased tenant satisfaction translates into increased retention, which, yes, translates into increased revenue for your center. In addition to these, it increases the sense of ease that you might have around your job and your role. Can enhance efficiency for getting your job done. And this last one, I definitely am borrowing from our managers roundtable. Having these kinds of relationships and this kind of more hands-on approach can increase the amount of grace that you as a property manager are given by your tenants. So the more you know them, the more they trust you, the more they know who you are, the more likely they are to understand when it takes you a few days to repair whatever it is that broke, right? And the last thing is that engaging your tenants in a strategic and consistent way can help you guide asset management decisions moving forward. So thinking about what's the long game for your building, what's the long game for the folks inside your building, and how to make those decisions in an informed way. And to sum up, basically, taking this approach to an enhanced property management structure can allow you to increase or at least stabilize revenue and increase your impact, both inside the building and outside your walls. Okay, so let's take a breather here. I think I've talked for 30 minutes straight. So I want to just take a little step back. For those of you out there who are not already doing all of these things and or who feel like maybe you are doing them but need some additional guidance, I want to say, let's take baby steps. You can't do it all at once, and that is okay. So what we've got here are just a handful of steps you can take, concrete steps you can take today, tomorrow, next week, to start moving your own work style in the direction of one that has an eye toward community engagement. Talk to your tenants, and not just the office manager, the CFO, the ED, whomever it is that you have as your point of contact. Try to make a point to get to know and talk to as many tenants as you can who are working inside of your building. Engage them consistently and engage them in both formal and informal settings. This doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go out and add a consistent tenant meeting if you don't already have one, or start hosting happy hours once a month if you don't already have them. But find ways, start thinking about ways within your team to set up these situations in which you can communicate. Start measuring how things are going. Use the data you already have in the form of leases, lease durations. If you have already captured tenant satisfaction, keep doing it. Taking on some simple survey tools through online mechanisms like SurveyMonkey, or even just printed half sheets that you pass out and incentivize the return of. Start collecting information that will allow you to benchmark how things are currently going. We encourage this air of experimentation. While nonprofits have been sharing space for all of time, and humans have been sharing space since longer than that, the shared space movement as a formalized concept, the co-working concept, the nonprofit shared space centers, this is a relatively new thing in the industry and is something that's only now starting to get the attention of the commercial side of the coin. So what it says to me is that we've got a lot of room to test out new ideas, to stretch our wings, and to see what works. So what we encourage is that consider things like signage, furniture, low-key, low-energy, low-budget programs, all as ways to start experimenting within your space to set up and create a culture of relationship and connection. And pay attention to what works and what doesn't. So one of the things we had, just a quick example on this, a center that we were working with had a giant donated table sort of in the middle of their common area. I don't even think it had chairs around it, but it was too big to get out of there. They didn't even really know where it came from. And it was not getting used. It was just in the way. And so one of the ideas about experimenting with that, that what could be perceived as an annoyance, but what we were trying to frame as an asset, was let's put out a puzzle on it, a giant puzzle that would allow for folks to stop by, put together a few pieces on their way to and fro. That experiment didn't necessarily go the way we thought it would, but it was something that we could try out, test out, and see, observe how it worked, and then iterate based on that. So feel free to try things out, and it's okay for things not to work. It's just not okay to ignore things not working. And then the last thing we'll say, just as a baby step to take in this direction, is make a plan. So if shifting your staffing model to support a more intentional approach isn't an option right now, start working toward a financial model that will allow you to do so. Think about what it means for your lease rates or your other fee structures for your grant writing, et cetera, to allow for a margin within your staffing structure to add in some of these functions. So as a wrap up and a summary, these are kind of the key takeaways from the content today. Get clear on how your property management supports the vision of your overall organization and center. Define who you serve as the property manager. Define to whom you are responsible and accountable, and clearly define the roles and responsibilities of that property management function. Define what your expectations are about tenant service, how quick, in what manner, and by whom are you responding to folks and their needs. This is something that can be simply done within your property management team. Can also be something that is, if you have a tenant council that already exists, that you engage them with and get their feedback on. Additionally, identify skill sets that you have and what gaps need to be filled, and enhance your team's capacity with staffing that fits both your needs, your gaps, and your budget. And with that, I'm at the end. So I'm going to pass it back over to Lara for just a sec.
Fabulous. Thank you, Megan. That was wonderful. It ties in so well with so many other things that have been going on. And I just want to take a moment before we turn to questions to just highlight some of those things. For one, I just want to let folks know this that NCN will be publishing our staffing report, which will cover salary information from our survey last year and just staffing of centers in general. So be watching for that. I think it ties in really nicely with this. And in addition, this whole presentation is tied in really well with our collaboration project, which is just sort of wrapping up, and I know a number of folks on the call are participating in that as well. And we've been spending a lot of time just thinking through more the collaboration side of this equation, and talking a lot about what do we mean when we say collaboration. I think a lot of these issues really come to play in the community animator role in terms of getting clear on what exactly, like it's pretty clear what's expected on the facilities management side, but it's not always clear what we mean by the collaboration side. So just wanted to sort of ask you, or start off the question period with just your thoughts around, understanding better. You talk about setting goals and being clear about your vision. We've, I think, sort of learned in the collaboration project that you can have really what we would call like a collaboration plan in terms of how much collaboration and at what different levels. And I think I'm just curious if how you've seen that weave into some of the roles that you've seen folks in. Are they clear on what's expected of them in terms of collaboration? Do they have any kind of best practices that you've seen? And that also brings me to sort of the second part of this question, which is, we heard from the private sector on the webinar a couple months ago around how much time the private sector actually devotes to just working with the tenants, talking to their tenants. I mean, they really make such an intentional effort around, blocking off 50% of an FTE's time to just be going around talking to people. And so the second part of my question is around, and maybe it's the same answer because maybe we don't have as much time dedicated to this, but are there best practices that we can pick up that help people organize their day so that they can actually get around and talk to folks? Because it seems like you need to know what you're trying to accomplish in terms of collaboration and those softer stuff, but then we also have to figure out a way for them to actually have some time to be talking to tenants and not be pulled away into all kinds of facility things. So if we can start the Q&A session off with that, that'd be great. Oh, and I did want to share, we will be sharing Megan's slides. So if anybody is wondering, we'll be sending those out after.
Thanks, Lara. I'm glad I took notes on what those questions were, because those are really excellent. So we'll start out with the first question, which was best practices as it relates to, I think what you were getting at is integrating this concept of using the property management function to support and enhance collaboration. So sort of the activation or implementation of your collaboration plan, if you will. And some of the best practices that we've seen kind of go for any change management strategy. What we're trying to do in most of these spaces is help folks move from independently functioning siloed organizations to a higher level of integration and partnership, right? So we're trying to help support them in a change, in a culture change sometimes, an organizational change sometimes, maybe just a change in how they do business. And so change management and change management with human beings is what we're talking about, is not ever an easy thing. But two of the key takeaways for any change management strategy, and that I think really apply well in this context, are consistency and implementation of a feedback loop. So consistency meaning that you've got consistent touch points, you've got consistent messaging, and you're really clear and consistent on what it is you're trying to accomplish. So when I show up in front of a tenant and say, hey, here to check in with you, my intent and my sort of the underlying reasoning about why I'm there is very clear. So if my collaboration plan has me checking in monthly with every program officer or lead, I don't know, whomever the point person might be from your tenant organization, that we've got a set of consistent talking points, if you will, about what we're trying to capture. And then the other piece is that you've got a feedback loop built in to be capturing what it is you're doing, if it's working, and how you might use that information to inform the next time you do it. So some of this could look like informing how you run meetings, for example, or how you send out tenant communications, or the ways in which you use your regular newsletter or something, but including some feedback mechanisms so that you can fine-tune that to better fit the needs that or the goals that you're working toward. And then the second question that you posed was, as it relates to tenant relationships, the private sector is clearly spending a lot of time doing this as well. Tenants are the financial base of a commercial building. Their satisfaction is directly related to their retention, which is directly related to the financial margins on that building. And so dedicating a pretty significant amount of time to ensuring that those needs are being met is clearly a priority in the private sector. Where I would say that we've got where we sort of layer on an added expectation within these mission-driven spaces is that tenant interaction isn't just about the bottom line. It's also about creating something more, sort of a social return in addition to the financial return. And I think that is just an important thing to know. And I think we sometimes risk, because we don't structure our property management always along these traditional lines, we sometimes are sort of cobbling together that tenant engagement piece out of multiple staff functions or on the part of somebody who wasn't necessarily hired for that role, right? So we're not giving the same amount of attention to it that the private sector is, because we're not necessarily prioritizing the bottom line in the same way as the private sector. So what I think I'd like to get at with this content and sort of in answering this question is that if we can draw those two together, that double bottom line concept is that you've got to do this so that you can be financially sustainable, and you've got to do this if what you think you're doing is making a social impact. So then to the hard part, how do you actually find time to do these kinds of functions? And I think I'd like to believe that part of that comes on the front end around how you structure the job description and the sort of expectations for that person's role, and making it very clear the amount of time and the types of outputs or what have you that person is supposed to be accomplishing. I think if you are that person in that role of trying to manage your time in a way that allows you to get around to all of your tenants, as well as connect with that vendor and plunge the toilet and refill the paper towels, that gets a little bit more tricky. And I think we'll want to save that I'm going to just punt that for another time as we build out perhaps a little bit more robust curriculum around these kinds of roles. So other questions? I'm going to read a question that Katie has written from one of you out there who will remain nameless, it appears. All right. The question is this: can I contract with a traditional property management manager to fill this position, given the increased focus on tenant relationships? So this is related to that importing expertise as a strategy. I would say probably, and this is why. If you kind of shift back to the kind of process that you go through to identify what kind of third-party support or consultant that you need to bring in. Part of that, the first step of that is to identify what it is you already have in place. There we go. And where you might be lacking. So what we've seen is that there are centers that contract out the facility part of the property management and then manage in-house the tenant relations, because that's where their core competency is. So I think the short answer to that question is yeah, especially if you're already pretty good at that tenant engagement piece. If what you need filled in your center is not the facility side of the coin, but more so on the tenant leasing, tenant recruitment, tenant retention, and or community management and community development, you'll have to, I would recommend definitely doing some rigorous interviews, because commercial property managers will tell you themselves that oftentimes that is not their core competency. That they often fall on more of the side of the black and white, day-to-day management, get stuff done kind of approach, and less so on the people skills side. So in following up to that question, we've got another question that is, if you were hiring a new property manager for a nonprofit center, what would you look for? Which is a great question. And I have some answers for sure. So some thoughts on that. First off, again, not to be a broken record, but being really clear on what it is you don't already have. So take a look at your staffing structure. This is going to be case by case, but in a lot of centers, what you need is that person that's able to definitely time manage, be a self-starter, and be able to have a strong sense of task completion. So you've got someone with that sort of logistical mindset, and also someone who gets energy from interacting with people. This is kind of key if what you want is somebody to come in and help cultivate relationships within your center, to have someone who enjoys and gets joy out of interacting with people. I am not down on introverts at all. I just know from some introverts that have been in this kind of role that it can be really taxing to be expected to be that face and be sort of quote unquote on all day for your tenants if that's not something that gives you energy. Oh, nice. Oh, we've got another question here from Mark. Thanks, Mark. What are some other, quote, low-key programs, like the puzzle on the common space table example that I gave, that other people have tried, and both good or bad? So there's your very easy, although it does require a little bit of legwork, your typical happy hour or your typical lunch potluck. These are, I would classify them as low-key. What it involves is 12-pack of beer, 2 bottles of wine, a veggie tray, depending on how big your building is, a sign up the day before, an email out, and if you've got a PA, an announcement over the PA 20 minutes before it starts. So that's kind of a low-key example. I would say these are great for drawing out your less typical players within the space, some of the staff that you might not see in other functions. But it might not necessarily be the space where you start building true collaborative partnership and relationships. Another a lower key, although this is a little bit involved, program that I've seen function pretty well is doing a regular monthly lunchtime sort of brown bag, where you pass it, you kind of punt it, the content piece off to one of your tenants. So where the tenants present on the work that they're doing and pose a challenging question or a thought-provoking content item or what have you back to the folks in attendance. What we see kind of the challenge with this one is that if you're not providing food, it doesn't tend to get a ton of attendance, I don't think. So that's kind of a challenge. So budget-wise, it can be prohibitive to be providing food. But those are 2 approaches that I would recommend from a low-key perspective. All right, so the next question up, we've got, how do you handle and work with tenants who don't have the best internal communication? For example, our main points of contact are fully aware of policies and procedures. However, it's not communicated down, and therefore it doesn't get communicated effectively to their staff internally and leads to issues when we try to enforce when only one person is aware of the rules. Oh my goodness, this is such a good example of why it's so critical to find ways to connect with more than just your single point of contact. Unsurprisingly, nonprofits, just like the rest of humans, aren't always great at communicating. And so what we have found is take advantage of touch points elsewhere in the process of bringing on people. So one center we have won't give the print driver to new staff people on their laptops until that staff person has gone through an orientation. So this is an orientation provided by the property management, not communicated or reliant upon their internal ED or training procedure. Another approach that we've seen is posting a new, this is kind of annoying maybe, but posting the expectations for behavior or cultural, community covenant items or basically just good behavior kinds of things in a visual way, change it up monthly and post it on the back or front of your bathroom stalls. So integrate this into a visual touch point, change it up because again, signs that have been there forever tend to disappear for people's visual awareness. But think of those other places where those staff who maybe aren't aware of what the policies are going and where they're interacting and where they might be consuming information and get that information about use in front of them. The other way is in a consideration might be to tie it to an emergency planning or emergency manual process. So all folks need to sign off on or understand. I mean, that's a pretty critical liability piece, which might require them to sign off and submit an acknowledgement of receipt for that management document, or excuse me, emergency manual document. You could use that as a touch point. You could also require them to, all new staff, when they're getting their key card, when they are getting their access to the building, getting their intranet set up, have them attend a 15 to 20 minute orientation that's scheduled on a regular basis. All right, and I think we're getting maybe close to the end, but we've probably got time for maybe one more question after this one, depending. So we've got another question here. Have you seen any projects use a barter model where a tenant does some community animation functions in exchange for free or reduced rent? Yes! Oh, you're so brilliant. What a good idea. We know for a fact that Center for Social Innovation uses a barter system. Well, I say that, I know for a fact since I asked Shona a year ago, so I hope they still do it, where they actually do a work trade. And their community animators function as kind of a concierge or host at the front desk, as well as some of the programs management on the back end, and they do this in exchange for desk time. We've also seen some approaches getting talked about where you can actually incentivize access to additional amenities in exchange for running of programs. So access to additional conference room space, event space, or other kind of goodies that you might have at your disposal as the landlord in exchange for tenant partners taking on some of that role. Good idea, guys. All right, and last but not least, we talked about the handoff from the community animator to the tenants or to take on collaborative activities. That seems really hard in practice. Any thoughts? Yes, it is pretty hard in practice. Some thoughts about this are, I would heavily lean on those folks in your organization or the training and capacity builders in your community that have resources around volunteer management, because what this essentially is creating a volunteer program. Think about how, if you have interaction with your board members, for example, think about how you set them up to succeed as a volunteer and engage them in specific projects or programs that are well suited to their skill sets. So some thoughts on making this successful, making this handoff successful, is really knowing your tenants, identifying what their interests are and core capacities, and then also finding some things, so sort of that carrot that is reciprocal. So if you know that someone in a marketing capacity is really working to build their marketing portfolio, try to talk through with them what a program might look like to help leverage that skill set and connect them with a couple of other tenants in your building needing those kinds of supports. Or if you've got somebody who's really needing and wanting to get some event management and planning experience. These are good ways, especially with maybe entry-level staff or folks who are newer in the industry or in their careers, ways to get them engaged in resume building functions, but also in ways that can help hand off some of that delegation of tasks to them from your plate. And again, I can't emphasize enough the recognition that this would be a volunteer program, and to treat it as such. And there are skills out there, so don't recreate the wheel, but lean on those resources that we have at our disposal in the industry around how you use volunteers to maximum benefit for for the goals that you've set up. And with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Lara to close us out. Thank you all so much for being on the call. I hope you weren't playing too much free cell or checking too many emails while we were speaking, and look forward to connecting after this if you've got any follow-up questions. Thanks so much, Lara and Katie, for inviting me to be here.
Fabulous. Thank you, Megan. This is great. It's always fun to have Megan and bring some of the expertise that she sees in the Denver area. And I think for those of you who were in Philly 2 weeks ago, we heard a lot of themes that came up in our 2 days there around aligning self-interest and getting tenants to kind of, or to be able to recognize that collaboration doesn't just happen, but you as a kind of the operator of your space are always working to sort of increase those number of interactions and see how you can play to people's self-interest and connect those dots and get get results by having folks kind of working on what they would be working on anyway, but just doing it together can be a smart approach. So I wanted to I also wanted to offer that the collaboration project report, when that comes out, will also have our 1-hour collaboration toolkit that we talked about. So just going back to what Megan had said about some of those sort of low-key strategies, I think the cohort from the collaboration project had some great ideas for what you can do in an hour to build collaboration in your center. So do join us in June on the 22nd. We're going to do our webinar on a summary of the collaboration project. So we'll be hearing from some of the folks who are part of the cohort, telling you about the prototypes that they worked on to build collaboration and what could be replicated in your center. So we're looking forward to that. As always, do be in touch. Let us know what we can do to improve the webinars, and we'll be sending out the slides, and the recording of this will be available on the website soon. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day, and we'll talk to you in June.